I've been meaning to get to this game for a long time. Business strategy. This is an old Avalon Hill game. It's kind of an interesting. It's got a kind of an interesting history. I just picked this up a couple of years ago and have never actually played this version. I think this is an expanded version of the old business management game which I played once with a friend who put it out as, you're gonna love this. It's just like. And go to why, and it's harsher than 18xx and this, that, and the other, and in a lot of ways it really is. This was a game where bad decisions very quickly got you into bankruptcy in the game. I don't remember too much about it. For example, I don't think it had these business climate cards in the original business management, but it had the same kind of board. It came in a bigger box. And followed the same core principle to the game. The core principle is actually the same one that came out in a somewhat later game, I think later, published under the 3M bookshelf titles. I don't know if there was some cooperation with Avalon Hill that was a stripped down system of this called Executive Decision. Executive Decision is this really kind of neat little simplified game where you put a bid in on how many raw materials you want of different types, you produce different types of goods, and then you bring the goods to market at different prices. This game and its predecessor used that same model, but there's only one type of raw material and only one type of finished product in it. However, there's a lot more going on here than is going on in an Executive Decision. Executive Decision is a very clean, simple little game that you could pretty much teach anyone. Now this one has 3-4 levels maybe of complexity to it. Not a lot of rules. And then a sheet double-sided of these to get you to the most complex game. But there's almost the assumption that you have a pretty good idea of the business concepts behind it to be able to play it. So don't let the smallness of the rules confuse you. There's a lot of complexity kind of hinted at, kind of covered up here in terms of not a lot of rules being explained, but a lot of concepts that may not be familiar to someone who doesn't have, a little bit of microeconomics or something in play. Okay. The very basic game. Well, the first thing is you get to choose different types of play. You can play the game either on a time limit, which can be a strict time limit. Hey, we'll play for 3 hours, and when that timer goes off, we'll finish up the year or whatever, or a certain number of years, or you can play the really cruel version, which is until you manage to bankrupt everyone. I'm not sure that really managed, completely bankrupt everyone else is necessarily feasible, though. It seems to me that you might get a position where you're unable to get a grasp on someone else's throat. I'm not sure about that because the only time I played business management, we were all going in the tank real quick, and it was just a matter of who goes down to the bottom quickest. I don't remember if we made it through a year. Okay. So in the basic game, well, there are only 6 phases of play. You're going to pay out a set of fixed expenses, which, I don't know, that's listed here. Standard factories are going to have a fixed expense of $1,000. Automated factories cost $1,500, and then you have a storage fee as well for raw materials and finished inventory that you haven't been able to move, materials that you haven't been able to produce yet. And that's just something you pay at the beginning of each turn. Then you're going to flip one of these suckers over, and what they're going to tell you is, based on the number of players in the game, how many raw materials are available for bid, what the minimum bid is on them, and then eventually what the possible demand is, and the maximum amount that you can demand from the prices of the of the goods that you're producing. And you're all in a competing field, so you're all producing automobiles or something. All right. Then you simultaneously decide how much stuff you're going to produce. And production has its own cost here. A standard factory converts raw materials into finished inventory at a processing cost of $2,000, and you'd basically just be converting one unit of raw material into 1 unit of finished inventory. An auto factory can convert 2 RMUs into 2 FIUs each month for $3,000. And there you just move 2 over. And you're going to use these little markers to indicate what you have of each type of resource in the game. There's only 4 resources. All very simple, all very intuitive, actually. Okay. And you pay whatever production cost of whatever you want to produce. You can leave things as RMUs if you want, if you don't think you're going to have much capability to sell. Now, you're going to go through another bidding round where everybody puts down a maximal, a minimum amount or an amount they're trying to sell for, and how many units of their FIUs they're willing to sell at that amount. And, okay, let's slow down here. We'll get to the bidding in a moment, but I'm just giving you the overview of the core phases there. Then you're allowed to borrow up to half the value of your capital, the factories that you have on the board at any given time. When you borrow the capital, when you borrow against that capital, you're allowed to borrow half of it. You're going to pay 10% interest every turn on that. And then at the end of the period, which is always 1 year, 1%. Yeah, 1% interest per month. Yeah, big difference. And at the end of the period, you have to pay the principal back as well. You must take a loan out for a complete year. You're not allowed to do it at any other periods. This is just the basic game. At any time, if you can't meet cash obligations, for example, if you can't meet your standard cost for items, if you can't meet your interest payments, you're bankrupt. But you can try to resolve that by cutting a deal, and you're out of the game and everything's just gone. You can try to cut a deal to keep you in the game. And if you get enough cash to keep you in the game from, say, selling off some RMUs, factories, whatever, to another player, then you're allowed to continue. But you cannot continue. You can't, it's kind of like in Monopoly in this, you can't sell off, all your goods really cheap and try to give somebody a bonus there. What you can do, though, is sell off all the goods to cover your current liability. Now, you don't have to cover future liabilities. For example, if you owe the bank a loan, well, you can kind of default on that by selling all your property to someone else for $1 plus whatever you owe. And that's okay. That's the basic game. You either play until you bankrupt everyone but one player, or until the time limit, and then whoever has the most cash on hand wins. Not net worth. Nobody's worried about that at this point. That makes it very, very difficult to expand your production. And I believe that's how it actually is handled. Yeah. Cash on hand, and you're supposed to play for an entire year. Okay, the next segment is this basic business game. I'm definitely going to do this. This adds a few little rules to the game. Some of the climate cards are going to have special rules on them that are in effect for that turn, which will take into effect where that comes into play. Not really sure there's much more here. I'm not sure you're actually allowed to make sales in the basic game. Oh yeah, you're allowed to sell things to competitors. Okay. Yeah. Okay, one big difference, you're allowed to make split bids. So instead of making just one bid, you're allowed to make multiple bids. For example, I haven't explained bidding. Let's go back to that. We wanted to do that. All right, so if you're bidding on a raw material, let's say you're playing a 2-player game and there's 2 units available. Under the basic game, you could bid any number, $800 or more per unit, on one or two of those units. So you could say, I want one at $900, or I want two at $850. And if you've got the highest bid, you get the amount that you want it. In case of ties, it goes to somebody who's known as the prime bidder or first bidder or something like that, who just gets an advantage in that situation. So, and yeah, ties go to the senior bidder for the turn. And you get however many that you want it. And then the next bidder gets however many they wanted at the price they bid. So basically, you're entering into a contract with the supplier or with the wholesaler or whatever for buying or selling a certain number. So with the raw materials, you're buying a certain number of them. So if I bid 2 at 900 and you wanted 1 at 850, I would get my 2 at 900. I'd pay $1,800 and my little marker would move up on there. If on the other hand, I bid for 2 at 850 and you bid for 1 at 900, you would get your 1 at 900 and there's only one left for me to get at 850. But I got a discount on it, right? Okay. Figuring out what those bids are going to be is going to be really tough in a solo game, but I'm just going over the rules at this point. Now, in the business game, the difference is that you're allowed to make 2 different bids at the same time on one particular thing. And the selling works sort of the opposite. So for example, if I put a bid in to sell 6 units at the minimum $6,500, I'm not guaranteed to sell all 6 of them, but if I'm the first bidder, I am, and I'll take up the entire slack of the market. On the other hand, I may not want to sell for the least I possibly can. So these guys cost me $800 each, whereas the finished inventory, well, it's going to cost me at least $1,000 to process it. But you can see there's a big difference. Oh, I'm sorry, $6,500 is the maximum market value. So if I bid at that, chances are I won't be able to sell any of them. But I can sell for any number smaller than that. So if I'm selling, if I bought my raw materials at, say, $900 and I put $1,000 of production in, well, I spent $1,900 on it. I probably won at least $2,000, so I might put a bid in to sell them at around $2,000. But it's possible to try to undercut your opposition and bankrupt them by preventing them from making any sales. You have a certain amount of money, and if you can put them in the toilet, and that's usually what this game actually tends to be about, even if you're playing for a long period, if one person realizes that he can dominate the market and drive all his competition out, he can win the game that way by just knocking out the competition. So it ends up being this spiral of death in a lot of cases. Anyway, rather than some sort of expansionist game. It may require some modifications to make the game work correctly, to actually perhaps reflect some sort of stable model, but that's not what this game does. As I said, this is one of the crueler games that I've seen for economics. All right, and the reason for that is because you have these factories that you have to pay a basic maintenance for. Executive decision takes that out of it. It's just production and sales. So you want to make a margin there on every sale. On this, you want to make a small negative margin so that you drive other people underground by them taking a larger margin just off their fixed expenses. Usually. All right, so the special here is that there's these split bids in which I'm able to, in either the buying or selling phase, offer one number at one price and another number at another price. Now, the worst price for me as the player gets reacted to first. So for example, let's say I am offering to buy 1 unit of the raw materials at $800 and 1 at $900. I get 1 for $900, and then if there's another one left over for $800, I get that one as well. In particular, let's say you bid for 2 at $850, I bid for 1 at $900 and 1 at $800. I would get 1 at $900, you would get 1 at $850. and the other bids would not exist. You have the opportunity, for various reasons, to shut down a factory, at which point the fixed expenses are cut in half. You declare that you're shutting down a factory, I think, at the end of a month, during capital improvements of a month, which is phase 6. Now, phase 6 exists here, where you can construct factories. I didn't go over that, and order construction of new factories. So a new factory, you pay a 50% down payment on the value of the factory. And I'm looking for the cost. Here it is. So if you buy a standard factory, it costs $5,000, and you're not going to get it for 4 months. So you put $2,500 down, and in 4 months you owe the other $2,500. Now at that point you can mortgage the factory for half its value, and so you can pay off that secondary cost. So you only need the cash up front for that. An automatic factory costs $10,000, but takes 6 months to go. And if you're converting from a normal to an automatic, it's going to cost you $7,000. The advantage to that, though, is that you're getting a cheaper factory in the long run for business running. The problem? Well, capital expenditures don't make sense in this game. They're just a way to go bankrupt more quickly. All right. Depreciation. Factories will depreciate in value by 10% each year, which primarily means that you're going to be able to borrow less money off of them. Once the value depreciates down to 0, the factory still seems to operate, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The 10% is 10% of the original value. It's not 10% of the current value. So you don't always continue with a residual value. And the factories operate perfectly fine, which doesn't make a lot of sense either. This is just really a bookkeeping thing, which matters in the final corporate game, which is sort of the most advanced of these. This one allows some other opportunities, which is players are allowed to increase the potential market for the inventory by paying advertising. Now, after you pay fixed expenses, you secretly write down how much money you want to advertise in your market. That total amount will be summed together, and that'll indicate the total number of additional finished units that are added to the card as to how much demand there is for your product. Great. So if I put money in, I'm helping everybody, right? Yeah, kind of. But I'm also helping myself if I paid the most on advertising. Ties resolve in favor of the senior bidder. I'm allowed to basically add $300 to the bid I claimed. So if I bid, let's say, no, I actually subtract 300 from it. It doesn't matter one way or the other. It works the same way. So let's say I put in an original bid for sale at $4,000. My bid would be resolved as though I had bid $3,700, but I get paid the $4,000. Basically, I'm more competitive because of my advertising, but only if I'm the guy who put the most in advertising. All right, now we get to the really complex stuff in this one, which is that you have this normal tax type, form to keep track of all, just a spreadsheet to keep track of all the sales and purchases you make. And that probably doesn't really need too much to be tracked, except you need to bid. But here we get to the profit and loss statement. And well, that's just going to determine your net profit and loss, and that's not too hard to do. You fill this out at the end of a year in order to pay your taxes for that year. You also, though, have at the beginning of the game a certain certificate liability, where you have some 32 shares of certificates that are in play. Now, that's handled here in your stock record. Once per year, I think at the end of the year only, you're allowed to try to release more stock. You start off with 32 shares released with a total liability of $32,000. And that's actually the value of your company at the beginning of the game. So you've totally, you have, you've just started essentially. You've sold the stock and you have the value in your hands. If you want to release more stock into the market, you can only do that if you've given out dividends equal to 10% of the net worth, I think it's not net worth, 10% of the book value of your stock that's currently outstanding. Okay? Now, so you have to pay out dividends during the term. Now, the book value of your stock that's outstanding is going to be equal to the amount of stock that's been issued plus essentially the surplus, which is your profit available. So essentially, any cash on hand, any inventory, and any fixed assets add up to a certain amount of money. Any loans you paid and stocks you issue add up to a certain amount of money. And the surplus is the positive you have above that to make the total liabilities equal the total assets. Okay, so then your book value is going to be the amount of money that you issued in stock, along with the surplus that you declared, and you have to pay 10% of that each year. Now, if you miss on 1 year, or decide not to on 1 year or whatever, you have a liability towards your stock worthiness. Basically, customers are not interested in whatever stock you might release until you make that all up. And I think there's a penalty in there if you don't. The dividends can only be paid from your surpluses. You have to actually be making money to pay out a dividend here. Dividends are not tax deductible. And if you pay out dividends and you're not in arrears on any of your payments, then you're allowed to issue more stock. And you do this once per year at the year end. You can only issue a number of shares equal to half the shares currently outstanding. And they'll be issued at the same par value. So if you issue, another 16 shares, you'll get $16,000 more dollars flush into your company at that point. Then, if your net profit exists, 50% of it has to be paid to the bank for corporate income taxes. Now remember, your net profit, if you've paid out dividends of 10%, you're going to be running very, very painfully here. All of this is kind of silly, I think, because the core game is harsh as hell. It's very easy to drive your competitors under the water, but there is all this extra stuff here. And on top of that, they handle government subsidies, which are going to be tax credits through the amount that you spend in processing through automated factories. And that says it's line 3B. So that's going to be your production over here, how much you spend for that. Let's see if it actually says how you do this. I don't think it does. Credits are direct reductions. For the sake of simplicity, this is built into the corporate. So I would guess however much you spend in using automated factories, you get as a lien from your taxes. I think that's what it's trying to say. That gives you a little bit more impetus towards building those automated factories, but trust me, I don't think it's going to help. And then at the end of each year, you're going to follow this little procedure. You complete your profits and loss statement. You pay taxes. at that point. You actually do it before you do your release of dividends. Then you figure up your balance sheet. If you have a surplus, you can pay dividends. You can pay any percentage you like, and it can be intended to make up for earlier years' failures. And then you record the dividend payments and any arrears that you are in dividends there in your stock record section. And then if you choose to issue additional stock, you get some additional cash on hand, and your stock is then also modified there. And that'll help you maybe make it through another year. But I'm not convinced, knowing this model, that if somebody tries to smash the model, if somebody tries to acquire a monopoly, that they can't basically do it. And then it just really becomes the death spiral towards the bottom, with everybody going bankrupt, but one person who can then turn it around and make whatever they like off the game from then on, because nobody else is playing. That's my opinion at this point. I do want to give it a shot, though. I found it interesting because, well, after having played Crusoe's Planet just recently, I kind of wanted to look at this Cutthroat model as well and see how maybe that differs from it, because this is purely played as a game. Someone who tries to play as cutthroat and monopolistically as they can should be able to pull off a win anytime they like against people who are trying to play with the intention of building up competing businesses in the market. But I just want to look at that. Like I said, this is a more complicated version of a system that's later used in executive decision, which takes away a lot of the dross. It just says, okay, you buy raw materials and you produce things. The difference there being that you've got 3 different types of raw materials to buy, and they combine to make different quality of 3 different quality of raw materials that combine to make 3 different quality of finished product. And you can use more expensive raw materials in the place of lower value stuff. It also, something similar with this kind of bidding mechanism and the prices being set by people choosing, although it's a much, much more interesting system in that sense, is the system used in Star Trader. It's clearly derived from this, but it sets a fixed price where the market actually moves. Actually, I think executive decision uses that. This one, the price is actually fixed just by what people do to the price. The markets in executive decision and Star Trader show some residual effect of previous supply and demand that this one doesn't. But there is still some significant similarities between the two systems. This one just seems a little bit more simplistic on the bidding side, but a lot more complex and, I believe, more brutal than either of those games. All right, let's send this one up.